Today I'm going to be taking a look at this small NAS that I built. I actually built this for my sister-in-law's place because they don't have any real backup solution. I think she's using an external hard drive for their, I think they've got a MacBook or two. And yeah, it would be nice to have something automated, such as a proper FreeNAS based system with time machine shares, so Apple devices can just back up automatically to it. Another aspect of this is that it has a very large storage capacity for its size, so it can actually store part of our own NAS remotely. And the idea is that her machine will back up to this and will then transfer its data over to our computer remotely, our NAS, and then parts of our NAS, because the storage capacity of our NAS is massive compared to this thing. This has 4 8-terabyte drives in a RAID Z2, so it's 16 terabytes total, whereas like our NAS has I think it's up to 76 terabytes of raw space. So yeah, we've got to pick and choose what we send between the two devices. I would like to be able to send my entire media library over here, and it does fit, but it doesn't leave much for expansion, so I don't think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to limit it to sending stuff like our photos, that sort of thing, important documents. This build actually took quite some time to get together because I've been trying to source all the parts, and it was just very difficult. The motherboard is extremely new, so it wasn't in stock anywhere. I finally found it in stock in a place, bought it. A day later they tell me, yeah, we don't actually have it, so they canceled my order. Then I had to keep searching again, and finally I found it. I even emailed Supermicro and their department that handles this sort of thing. No reply. They didn't even, just no answer of when it's coming in stock or anything. But anyway, it was around mid-December that it became available. So I did actually pick up one of the motherboards. This particular motherboard is the Supermicro A2SDI 4C HLN4F, which is part of a whole series of their newest generation small Atom-based boards, where they have a 2-core, a 4-core, an 8-core, and I think a 12 and 16-core model. And they're all based around basically the same hardware, except the 2-core version is stripped down, and the higher core count ones beyond 4-core have more of an expanded product range. I think they have a 10 gigabit Ethernet version and that kind of stuff. So the one I got, which is the 4-core one, there's just one model of it, and it's mid-range. It's about $300 or $250 to $300 depending on who you're looking at. And I think it's pretty powerful for what you're paying for it, and it's actually a pretty nice board. Although they did ship mine with the wrong I/O shield. This is the completely wrong I/O shield. And the funny thing is, it even says in the part checklist inside the motherboard box, it had the wrong thing. And it's like, check, yeah, we got that. Doesn't even fit the board. I don't know why they're sending them. I contacted their tech support. They told me to fill out an RMA. I told them I just needed the replacement part. So I filled out the RMA anyway, and it wants me to return the board. So I contacted the tech support again and inquired about my RMA, saying I don't need to send the board back, just send me the parts. Also, there was a serial ATA to mini SAS connector that is not included. They forgot to put it in the box. So that's another thing I wanted them to send out. So I just wanted them to send me these 2 parts. And now I'm just waiting. I have to call them or something and figure out what the hell they're doing. I don't know. Supermicro, I really love their boards, but it feels like if you're just a consumer, then they really don't care about helping you, at least in my experience. Anyway, I picked up a 4-bay hot swappable NAS enclosure, which we'll get into. Sorry, the table's kind of wobbly. It's actually a seam of 2 tables right here. Anyway, This particular one holds 4 drives, but there's an 8 drive model, and I think they might make a larger one too. And this particular case is very nice. Comes with power supply. Again, we're going to go into more detail of all the components, but I wanted something small that could hold the 4 drives. I don't see it going past 4 drives. They don't have that much data, and it'll probably just get upgraded to larger drives in the future. So 4 should be fine. It's a good trade-off of noise and power and stuff. The case size looks a bit exaggerated on camera, I think. It's actually a fairly compact system. It's actually so small it can easily fit inside our main NAS. It is quite heavy at around 16 pounds because the hard drives especially are quite heavy because they have so many platters, the 8 terabyte ones that I'm using inside it. It's equivalent to about 3/4 of a moose. So it's pretty heavy, but not that heavy. On the back, missing its I/O shield, the motherboard comes with USB 2, no 3, even though there's a 3 header on the inside. Or sorry, a Type A port. Weird. Standard VGA just for a console. Comes with 4 gigabit Ethernet ports. You could use these for multi-homing SMB, but I don't think FreeNAS supports it even in 11.1. So I just blocked them off because we're just going to be using one. This is an IPMI port for remote management. I'm not going to be using it. I'm just going to route it through this. You can do like a virtual interface through this, so there's no point in using a separate cable. It does support a PCI Express slot, and it has a flex power supply, which is basically just a 1U power supply, and a 120 millimeter fan. The fan that came with it is half decent. It was a little loud for my taste, and I just like to put Noctua fans in everything, so I pulled that out and put in a 120 millimeter Noctua. This specific case is a U-NAS NSC 410. Now they make a 401, which as far as I can tell is basically identical with the exception of slight changes to the dimensions. I think it's slightly smaller. And the internal arrangement means that you can't have, you get one fewer internal drive. This thing does support a couple drives just lying around in the case. And the arrangement is different. You don't get to put in that extra drive. I'm not going to be using any of them, so it doesn't matter. And it only supports a low profile expansion card. Whereas this one, the arrangement is that it clears the power supply and allows you to use a full-size card. So those are the main differences. Now, these I bought directly from the company website, unas.com, U-NAS. And it seems like they only sell by themselves. You can't buy them on eBay or anything, or on Amazon. There is a practically identical version of this on Amazon under a different name. So I'm going to put an affiliate link in for that because it seems to be exactly the same as this one. It's just under a different name. And I don't know which one is the original or if there's just a generic case that these guys are importing, but it seems to be a very nice case. It has this full metal surround on, which is kind of difficult to get off, but you know, you're not opening this up too often. And on the inside, you just simply mount your mini ITX board. It's got a whole bunch of wiring that I haven't sorted out yet. The case comes with audio ports, which is weird. I don't know why there's audio ports on this thing. I actually disassembled the whole front panel and removed the cable. It just disconnects from the board. There's a small PCB in here, which for some reason has, I don't know if, oh, that's not good for the drives. I don't know if you can see it, but there's actually a dip style socket here, an 8-pin dip socket, which I can only assume is for plugging in pins to the front header to drive the LEDs and stuff. I don't know what the point of that is. I did open it up, but at the time I didn't like trace out any of the circuitry on it, so it just seems really weird. There's also power and reset buttons, obviously with LEDs. There's another USB 3 port, and there's all the hot swap bays. They simply pop out with these buttons. They're very convenient. And I've got this like refurbished drive in here. Oh no, sorry, this isn't a refurbished drive. This is from an external hard drive case that I just took the drive out, and the rest are all WD 8 terabyte reds, just the standard 5400 RPM versions. Nothing fancy. Oh, one thing to note about these hard drive caddies is that they use kind of the old standard of where the hard drive screw placement is. So you can only hook up 2 screws on the larger, more modern drives because they've packed in so many platters. They don't actually have room for the screws there. They're actually further up here, and they just don't have screw holes. But it's not a problem. The 2 screws seem to hold it just fine. And these just come with they're all just completely passive, but they have a couple light pipes to shine activity and power LEDs through. As you can see, it gets pretty packed in here, and this is before I've done any proper routing of cables and stuff, but you can see there's just so many connections. You've got USB 2, USB 3, all these other connections. I would have liked to have seen them streamline the front panel I/O. Why do we have a USB 2 connector? Why not just have USB 3? You can always adapt them to 2 if your motherboard doesn't support it, which I believe I actually did on this board because there's no headers. And yeah, it comes with serial ATA cables, all that stuff. So it's actually wired in pretty nicely, and the whole thing is pretty good for airflow. It's not the best because the fan is, one, it's exhausting, and it creates a negative pressure which just pulls in air from all the gaps, so it'll fill up with dust pretty quickly. Not a real problem with them. They just have a tiny dog, so they won't get a mountain of fur like we would. So it'll work. You could reverse the fan, but then this one is also exhausting, so they'd be fighting each other, and it might just create like a loop where it doesn't properly pull through the hard drive cages. So I'm just going to leave it like that, and it'll work, but it's not ideal. I'd like to see them maybe mount the power supply at the front in a way that they could vent it or get an intake going there, and it would pull air through the hard drive cage, and maybe something to do with a way to channel air, or even an option for another fan somewhere to just get some flow over the CPU on the board, because a lot of these are passively cooled, and they do expect to have some level of airflow. Like I see, I've actually attached a 40 millimeter Noctua fan to the heatsink of this board just because I didn't like the temperatures it was getting to. And you know, this is the winter, so I can't imagine what it'll be like in the summer. So that should help a lot. Included with the case is this thin sheet of plastic, which just goes behind the board when you're screwing it in. So if the side of the case is pressed in for any reason while it's on, it won't short out anything. This thing does attract a lot of cat fur, though, I've noticed. Very staticky. And the motherboard kind of slots in. As you can see, it got pretty crowded with all the wiring I had to run in this thing. So yeah, it's a tight fit in there, and that's why I like having a more powerful Noctua fan, just to get a little bit more airflow through all this cabling. There's a surprising amount of I/O in this thing, as I was saying, because we have the 4 serial ATA connectors. There's 2 connections for USB 3, which makes no sense to me. There's one that goes down to the one port down here, and then there's another that goes to this port, which makes no sense. These can carry 2 connections, so why didn't they just have 2 USB 3 ports down here and a USB 2 at the front? Or better yet, just the 3s. Like, why even bother with this extra one? Although it is kind of convenient to pop in a USB stick. Why? It's so stupid having this one cable for one USB 2 connector when you and 2 of these, which aren't even the same like design. Like, this is a flat cable. Like, I don't know what they were thinking. It's possible that parts of this are holdovers from a previous revision of this case, but it seems like a really dumb decision, especially since it costs some more money. What is the point? And yeah, like I said, you could totally lose the audio. There's no point in having that. No one's going to be using that. Even if this was a media center PC and you were hooking it up to a TV in some way, what are you going to be using 3.5 millimeter audio for? It would all be going through the HDMI. So yeah, you could totally lose that. And the power supply, which is made by Delta, although I've seen in pictures some of them are made by Sparkle Power, which is also another reputable company, is actually very quiet. I'm very impressed with this power supply. I believe it is 180 watts. It's very quiet. Oh, sorry, correction. It is an 80 plus 250 watt power supply. It's very quiet under load, and I thought it was going to be really loud because every 1U power supply I deal with is super loud, but obviously those are designed for servers and they're putting in much louder fans. And this one is very quiet. I really like this one. I was prepared to buy a new one and like start replacing fans and stuff, but I didn't have to. The connections on it are pretty simple. It's just got a 24 pin standard power connector. It's got the a CPU power connector, Molex, or a few Molexes because the backplane uses 2, and like a serial ATA connector. So pretty straightforward. Power supply pretty much covers everything you'll need inside one of these, and like I said, it's from Delta, so it's a reputable company. I have no problems with it, and yeah, so that should be good. This particular board doesn't even use anything beyond the 24 volt standard power connector. It doesn't even use the 4-pin one. Also included with the case are a few screws for various hard drives. There's this bracket which lets you mount a system drive or an SSD into it. It also lets you mount hard drives into the top, I believe. There's a couple more brackets for it. But yeah, like I said, I'm not using any other drives. I'm just using the 4 serial ATA drives in this particular one. The backplane, as I said, uses a couple Molex power connectors. The connections to the hard drive backplane for the serial ATA are just standard serial ATA cable, so if one of these are ever defective, you can just replace it with a standard cable. The backplane connectors do say serial ATA slash serial attached SCSI, so in theory you could use an SAS controller on this for more speed, but I'm not sure how that works with just standard connectors. I can't remember if SAS drives can use standard serial ATA connector for higher throughput. I think they need their own fancy connectors, but I'm not sure. I don't have any SAS drives anyway. This is the model and specs for the particular power supply they gave me. Like I said, some of them may come with Sparkle power supplies. Also a very good company. I'm sure they're just as good, if not better, than these Deltas. This upper area is where you'd install a full-size expansion card. I think the 401 case is just slightly lower, so it doesn't actually clear this power supply, so it limits the height to about here from the motherboard, whereas this one's slightly taller, so it clears it and it allows you to use a full-size card. Won't be using a card in this thing, but that just gives you an example of how the two cases differ. Here we have the motherboard. This thing packs quite a bit of power into a mini ITX board, especially a low power ITX board. So we've got a standard 4X slot, which has the back cut out, and it's actually arranged in a way on the circuit board so that you could put a 16X card in. There's a M.2 slot. We have 4 serial ATA connectors, along with this mini SAS port, which lets you hook up 4 more. Port arrangement is kind of interesting and yet weird on this thing. The amount of serial ATA ports you get, up to 8, varies with how many ports you assign, or how many lanes you assign to the PCIe slot. So you can either choose to have more storage, or you can choose to have more I/O by enabling a faster card. But one thing I noticed with this is that these 4 ports, the standard ports, are not enabled by default. And I found out the hard way because I plugged in the 4 drives and it was only showing 2, and it was racking my head. Like I was just like going crazy trying to figure. I'm like shuffling drives around because 3 of the drives I bought were used using the eBay sellers that I mentioned in a previous video that I'll link in, because that does still seem to work. And I still seem to be getting drives from them okay. But anyway, the ports weren't all enabled, and I didn't realize that at first. So I was trying to get this RAID built, and it kept saying there's only 2 drives, and I'm thinking the backplane's broken. I went and swapped all the serial ATA drives or cables, and I'm freaking out because of the case will be a lot more of a pain to fix, because or to get repaired, because I threw away the box and everything already. It was a big box that it came in. So I'm like, oh man, it better not be this damn chassis. And yeah, it turned out that I had to change some settings in the motherboard BIOS to enable the ports. If I get that cable from Supermicro, I could just buy one, but they're like 20 bucks. So I'd like them to actually send the damn thing since it's supposed to be included. That will provide the 4 ports I need, and I could reassign these back to this if I needed to. The CPU on this is a 16-watt Intel Atom C3558. It is the newest generation as of filming of Atom chips, and it supports things like DDR4. In this case, it has 16 gigs of DDR4 ECC memory installed, registered. It supports up to 256 gigs of ECC memory, which is insane for a little board like this. The 2-core version has half the RAM slots and only supports 128 gigs, although I think the specs on Supermicro actually do say it supports 256. I don't know how you would do that. They don't make 128 gig DIMMs as of filming, so I don't know how you would get that done with just 2 slots. But if you wanted to spend thousands of dollars, you could fill this thing up with 256 gigs of RAM. The 2-core version also loses for serial ATA ports, I believe. But other than that, it's mostly the same. These newer cores are actually quite powerful. And the 4-core one in most tasks will usually beat the previous generation 8-core one. So it's pretty powerful. I wouldn't use a system like this for transcoding unless you get the more expensive 8 or 16 core versions, because transcoding it's going to run into limitations with this. I think in most cases you might be able to get away with the 4-core version actually, but this particular one uses 4 cores and 4 threads. There's no hyper-threading, so it's a pretty decent machine. It's just I probably wouldn't use it for too heavy a video encoding task. This is really going to be just a backup server, so I could have probably gotten away with the 2-core one. I just felt like the reduced RAM slots were stupid, and I thought that was annoying. And I figured it might actually be cheaper to get more smaller density sticks of memory than fewer higher density. Although currently I just have 16 gigs installed, so it's not running in interleaved mode, so the speed is reduced a bit. I would like to put in another 16 gig stick, but it's not super urgent. Again, this isn't doing anything other than just basically running Apple Share and SMB shares. As for power, it's a bit unusual because it uses a standard ATX power supply connector, and it has this 4-pin CPU connector, but it's not actually used for the CPU. This is if your system is just providing 12 volts, so you wouldn't use this, you would use this. It's an alternate power source, and this Molex connector, I believe, outputs power for running hard drives off it. If you're just supplying the system with power, it can control the power to the drives and that sort of thing. So you'd either be using these or this. Do you like my extremely classy wire-tied job on the CPU? Well, it works. I mean, it's not pretty, but it does work. They do make active heat sinks, but I don't know how you can actually buy them. Supermicro, again, did not reply when I asked if you could get an actively cooled version of this. So whatever, I have a 40mm fan lying around. I just stuck that on top. The board supports up to 3 fans, maybe 4. No, I don't think this is a fan connector. But anyway, yeah, 3 fans, which is more than enough for a small system. I'm just using 2, and that's about it. I mean, it's a really nice board for what you're paying for, which, you know, 300 bucks, or I think 200 for the 2-core one. It does have a single internal USB 3 connector, which is a Type A connector, so you can't actually hook up any of the front ports. I just have a 64 gig SanDisk USB 3 stick in there, works fine. You can even see where they would attach the other mini SAS port to the motherboard if I had one of the more expensive models. I believe both are emitted on the 2-core version. One thing I like to do on motherboards and just computers in general, and even the switches, is to just cover up all the ports that you're not going to be using. 1, it keeps dust out, and 2, it keeps you from plugging in Ethernet into the wrong port. For example, if you plugged it into the IPMI port, it wouldn't work properly for your system. But this, you just plug it up, and kind of makes it idiot proof. And it's also very convenient when you're like reaching around in the cabinet or something. You don't start plugging into the wrong ports. One thing to note about this system is that the BIOS only supports UEFI booting. It does not support the legacy BIOS mode. So that might limit you with some OSs. FreeNAS does work just fine with it. One thing to note is you do need to use 11.1 or higher. 11 will not work with this board properly because the Ethernet ports are not supported. There's no driver for the Ethernet controller on this. So you're stuck using 11.1, which is fine because 11.1 is pretty good. So not a big deal. I mean, unless you're way back on like 9 or something. But overall, I'm very impressed with this board. It was very difficult to get, and I hope I can get Supermicro to listen to me and give me those damn parts that they didn't ship and or sent me the wrong one. But other than that, I can highly recommend this motherboard. So the good thing about this build is that you can scale it really easily, either up or down. You can go for the higher core count if you plan on using more features, such as transcoding or whatever. You can go for an 8-bay case if you want more hard drives. Oh, cat fur everywhere at all times. And so you can go up to the 8-bay case if you want more storage. You can go down to a 2-core model if you want to save some money on the CPU, if you're really just hooking up hard drives to it. I believe they even make a 2-bay case for this, and you could use whatever case you have lying around. This just happens to be a pretty nice case with the hot swapping and whatnot. This particular build is way overkill for anything my sister-in-law would ever need for their place. The price on this thing is probably more than the MacBooks that they're backing up.
I never told him, but its worth was greater than the value of a shire.
I figure it's a fair deal that I buy all the hardware. In exchange, they provide us remote backup and power it. So I think that's a pretty fair deal. The only thing left to do is to put this all back together. I'm going to put it back together nicely this time with proper wiring and stuff. Turns out the situation with the USB ports is even weirder than I thought. Now, I didn't film this while I was putting it back together, but there are 2 USB 2 connectors and 2 USB 4 or 3 connectors. So there's four separate wires coming from this. There's 3 ports, and there's only one USB 2 port. So I have no idea what they're doing. I don't really want to disassemble the whole board. It's actually quite involved to take this front panel off. You have to just take out tons and tons of screws, which is another nice thing about this case. It's actually like not riveted in a lot of places. It's screws, so you can really take the whole thing apart. But I don't understand what the deal is with that. Unless they're running them to that freaking dip connector, I don't know where those USB connectors are going, and I don't know if the one I hooked up, I tried hooking, I've got the flat blue ribbon cable one hooked up this time. I don't know where that's going to go. Is that going to power one of the connectors? Is it not hooked up to anything? I have no idea. So that should be interesting. But now that I've got together, I'll plug it in so you can get an idea of the lights. Of course, it's covered in bright blue LEDs. Plenty of blue LEDs. Now, it kind of bleeds through a bit, but these all blink red when there's hard drive activity. But the rest of it is just all blue LEDs everywhere. And yeah, it's pretty bright. One thing that I hate about this system is that the fan controller is just idiotic. It's got motherboard fan connectors. You can't even change them in the BIOS. You have to go to the remote management interface and change it there. And even when you do, the options don't seem to make much of a difference. There's like a heavy I/O option, a standard, an optimal, blah, 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 blah. Unless you pick maximum, which just runs the fan at full, all the other ones just sit there going, vroom, vroom. They just rev the fan up over and over and over again, constantly. Why can't manufacturers just make a proper fan control in a BIOS, which just speeds it up if it gets above a certain threshold to try and keep it below a certain temperature? I don't. I think that's what it's trying to do, but there's no hysteresis on it, so it just constantly turns on and on and off, on and off, and it's really annoying. So I just set it to full, and I put a low noise adapter in for the fan to just keep it at a lower speed to keep the noise down. I'm going to do the best I can to explain how I arrange my data using my admittedly childlike drawing skills. So we're going to say, all right, so we've got the sister over here, our data over here. Her area is going to be really easy. There's going to be the mini NAS with some systems backing up to it, and it will send data over to our NAS, which I will draw to scale, which is gigantic. So the data in here is just a ZFS array, just like this one. It's going to be a RAID Z2, just like this one. So there's 2 drives set up for redundancy, so you can survive 2 failures. The arrays in this are set up pretty much the same way. We have a main array, which has Final Cut Pro and that kind of stuff on it. So there's the fast array, slow, and arc. I know I wrote that uppercase. It is not a ZFS arc. It's just an archive. That has nothing to do. ZFS arc is a part of the actual operating system. I should have written that lowercase. But the fast array is all 7200 RPM drives. The slow one are 54s. And the archive is a new array that I built post NAS video, which is 2 drives running at 5400 RPM. They are the AE series from Western Digital. They're like designed for cold storage. So I just have 2 6 terabyte ones in a mirror, so it can survive 1 failure. This data is stuff that I very rarely use. It's just like miscellaneous stuff. And it backs up to the slow array. The fast data, which is stuff like Final Cut Pro X, media. The media is huge. It's like 7.5 terabytes. So all of this stuff backs up to here. It also has the jails from FreeNAS, which isn't much data. It's not that important, but it also backs up. So this data is going to actually go into the slow array. This data also goes into the slow array, but it's also going to go over here, depending on what I choose. There's also network data saved, which is my PC, my Mac, and my wife's Mac. Well, they're Hackintoshes. They all back up to the slow array too, and they are just basic network shares. One is the Time Machine for the Macs, and I use a program called SyncBack Pro, which is a pretty good backup program for Windows, which is all I want it to do is mirror data. I don't want versioning or anything like that. I just want a program that just reliably duplicates data onto the server, and it does it really well. It was pretty cheap. I think it was like $50. So all that data I'm going to pick and choose, and some of that's going to go over there too. So using the ZFS replication, it's all handled internally, and it will also do all the external stuff too. So I'm going to have to set up port forwarding on their NAS to enable a connection through SSH, because that's what ZFS replication does. And I'll probably hook up a connection to the IPMI remote management. I would like to do a VPN, but my current router, the Verizon router, doesn't have a VPN server in it, and I've been working on setting it up in FreeNAS, the OpenVPN setup, but it's a pain in the ass. It hasn't been working out for me. So I might just bite the bullet and buy a small PF-Sense router. And I might just use the Verizon router to provide TV guide data, because for some stupid reason it has to receive data from the DVR through the coax connector instead of the freaking Ethernet port that it has. So whatever. I might do that. That'll be the next computer build, and it'll probably not even be a build. I'll probably just buy one of those PF-Sense boxes. Anyway, so I'm gonna have to route the data, and it's all encrypted. These drives are all encrypted, and these drives are encrypted, and the link between the two systems is also encrypted. So the data is all safe. The encryption on these is not, or that FreeNAS uses, is designed to protect you from someone stealing your drives and cutting the power. If the system is left running, which is funny because it's hooked up to a battery backup, if the system is left running, the data is all available. It's encrypted, but once you mount the drives, it decrypts it. So it's really geared towards, if a drive fails, you can replace the drive and not have to wipe it. But it's also nice that if the power just goes out, or if the computer is stolen without taking the UPS with it, the data is encrypted still. So altogether, there's like 76 terabytes of data on this one. Well, raw storage, and we've got the 32 on this one. So I'm gonna have to pick and choose what gets sent over where. It'll probably just be photos and that kind of stuff, like just important documents. The main thing will be photos. That's something that's very important. But the media could be tricky. It is okay to be sending a huge amount of data. One, I've already pre-backed it up, so if I do choose to keep the media, I've got it there already. I can just wipe it and free it up if I decide not to. But we have a gigabit link up and down, so sending data to this site is super easy. Their connection, I think, is like 50 down and like 5 up, whereas ours is like technically like 980 and 850 or something weird. But obviously I'll have to limit the times of day that replication takes place, because it'll just swamp their upload especially, and well, it'll swamp their download too. So it's just like totally kill their connection. So I can set replication to only occur in the middle of the night, or whenever, and on certain days. So it should work fine. There should be enough time to do all the replication, especially since the initial transfer has been done already. And I think that's it for my long rambling and horrible scribbling. So yeah, it was an interesting build, mostly due to tracking down all the parts from this thing and waiting for these motherboards to become available. But as simple as the build is, I think it's a really nice build in that, like I was saying earlier, you can expand it to whatever you need. It can be your main NAS. It doesn't have to be like a secondary one like I've done. It can be a main, just throw it in a closet or whatever NAS, and you can have an 8-drive version, you can have a 2-drive version. I think it scales really well, and yeah, FreeNAS in general is just great anyway.